You're watching Native American history. Imagine a ritual that moves food names leaders and decides who will live through winter that was the Sundance. Today we unpack how ceremony became policy in motion. Early summer, 1851, Horse Creek near Fort Laramie. Wind moves through willow and river grass, while delegations of Lakota and Cheyenne arrive along with traders and federal agents. Poles for seasonal lodges lie stacked on the bank. The prairie looks open and endless, yet new trails and survey lines begin to cut it into promises and obligations. This is the century when migration accelerates along the Platte in Missouri, when treaty language tries to fix borders on a moving world of hunts and visiting rights. It is also the century when camps must decide how to hold together after sickness loss raids and the pull of trade goods. In that pressure, the Sundance rises each summer as the shared work that says who the people are and what they owe one another. June 1876, Rosebud Country. Horse herds crowd the flats while messengers pass news of soldiers in the valleys. The lodge will go up because the year must be tied to its center before any fight or flight can mean more than chance. Elders speak of vows. Singers measure time with a drum. Women prepare water and shade. The act is not spectacle. It is governance by memory and gift. The principal actors are Lakota bands and Northern Cheyenne bands across the northern plains, with United States officers, agents, and traders as persistent forces on the edge of the circle. The central question is simple and hard. Why did this ceremony matter so much in the 19th century that it endured treaty rooms, battlefield smoke, and agency rules? The stakes are identity and survival. If the Sundance could convert grief into promise, name leaders without paper, move food and care toward the vulnerable, and set courage in the spine of the camp, then it was more than a rite. It was the yearly decision to remain a nation. 1851. Fort Laramie set the first formal frame. Delegations from Sioux bands, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, and others met federal commissioners to delimit hunting corridors and travel rights. Those lines were an attempt to impose fixed borders on a continent where people followed herds and kin. The treaty language created expectations on paper that could not easily be enforced on the ground. 1862, in Washington, Congress passed the Homestead Act and authorized transcontinental rail routes. The same year, federal policy prioritized settler access to land and capital for railroad construction. Tracks and emigrant roads began to cleave traditional ranges. By the 1860s, survey crews and bridge gangs moved into river valleys, once used only seasonally. The resulting traffic disrupted migration trails and hunting grounds in measurable ways. November 1864. Sand Creek transformed local politics into open rupture. The massacre of a Cheyenne village by Colorado militia produced new cycles of raids, reprisals, and fear. Survivors carried the loss into subsequent lodge seasons. The wounds did not stay local. They circulated across kin networks and sharpened decisions made at the next Sundance. 1868. The Bozeman Trail fights and Red Cloud's campaign made it plain that military patrols would not simply escort tracks. Forts were built along trails that had been trade routes. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty recognized large swaths of the northern plains as Indian country, but it also left agency lines and annuity schedules that became touchpoints for daily life. Treaties became both shield and leash. They set obligations for rations, policing, and schools while failing to stop settler encroachment. The economic base beneath plains life changed across these decades. Commercial buffalo hunting expanded in the 1870s and 1880s, with commodity markets and eastern demand for hides and sport hunting. Herds that supported subsistence and trade collapsed. Where kin networks once redistributed meat and hides, the new scarcity converted ceremonial gift economies into vital social insurance. Rations from agents replaced game for many families, and the timing and quantity of those rations thus became a political lever. Administrative shifts hardened these pressures. The agency system centralized distributions of food tools and annuities. Indian agents and Indian police became routine instruments of federal policy. Boarding schools and mission programs intensified after the 1870s, with Carlisle and other institutions teaching English and disciplinary schedules that cut against seasonal ritual life. Policies that aimed at assimilation also created daily dependencies. A family's access to iron kettles, shot, or flour now could hinge on agency records and compliance with officials. Immediate triggers multiplied in the field. Arrests for resisting agency orders disarmed key men at moments of tension. Instances of disarmament at agency posts or during inspections created spikes in mistrust. Instances of delayed annuities or reduced beef issues in late winters turned a single bad season into a humanitarian crisis. Harsh winters and outbreaks of disease amplified the effect of bureaucratic failure when agency deliveries were late. A family might lose horse or child rather than merely endure inconvenience. From the Lakota and Cheyenne perspective, objectives were continuity of seasonal mobility, stewardship of herds and families, and maintenance of social order through gift obligations and ritual authority. Constraints were concrete. The loss of bison reduced available meat and hides. Increasing settler presence interrupted wintering grounds. Treaties proved inconsistent in practice, and smallpox and other epidemics reduced population and labor. Logistics were local, and flexible extended kin networks pooled horses and drivers. Councils shifted camp locations. Village-level provisioning relied on cached supplies and reciprocal exchanges more than on fixed depots. From the United States perspective, objectives were settlement security, open transit for commerce, and the extension of federal law and institutions into the plains. Constraints included limited troop numbers dispersed across a vast territory, fragile supply lines to frontier forts, and political pressure from rail and homestead interests in Congress. Logistics were organized around forts, trading posts, and agency supply chains. Beef contracts sutured distant commissaries to local agents. Telegraph lines shortened some decision cycles, but could not resupply a frozen wagon in time. The result by the 1870s was a layered stress regime. Treaties and agency rules compressed seasonal decisions into bureaucratic appointments. Market forces and railroads hollowed out subsistence resources. Episodic violence and disease raised the cost of staying put, and administrative control redirected social obligations into rationing and record-keeping. Under that load, the Sundance operated less as optional worship than as an annual reckoning, an institutional moment when leadership obligations materialized, and names obligations and redistributions were made public, binding communities to a plan that could be executed in seasons of scarcity or reprisal. November 29, 1864, Big Sandy Creek, Colorado Territory, Cheyenne and Arapaho Village. The attack at Sand Creek began as a winter to early spring movement of people who had trusted Major Edward Wincoop's assurances and the Camp Weld discussions. It ended in a shock that traveled faster than riders. Men in volunteer regiments under Colonel John M. Chivington rode into a camp flying a white flag and a United States flag. The weather had been cold and clear. The scorched ground froze the marks of dozens of horses. Survivors later described mutilation and widespread killing. News of the action moved by courier into Denver, and along the Missouri telegraph wires carried official replies and the first outraged messages to Washington within days. The immediate effect was structural bands that had accepted agency protection now dissolved into mobile raiding coalitions. Women and old men fled to remote draws, and horse herds were rounded up or scattered. The attack hardened alliances between Cheyenne and Lakota leaders and made peaceful negotiation the less likely option in many winter councils. Silas S. Soule letter, Fort Lyon, Colorado, December 14, 1864. It was a horrible scene, and I would not let my company fire. They were friendly, and some of our soldiers were in their camp at the time trading. It looked too hard for me to see little children on their knees have their brains beat out like dogs. After that letter, the narrative of the day could not be smoothed by military dispatches. Testimony traveled by letter and then by committee in Washington. December 21, 1806, near Fort Phil Kearny, Wyoming, Bozeman Trail approaches. The Fetterman fight was a tactical counterpunch that followed years of intrusive travel routes and newly built forts along the Bozeman Trail. A detachment under Captain William J. Fetterman and a party of civilian woodcutters left Fort Phil Kearny in winter cold and deep snow after scouts reported a decoy force. Leaders among the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho used a classical lure, small-mounted parties appearing to retreat, to draw the soldiers over a ridge and into an ambush in a timbered coulee. Couriers from the fort reported the missing patrol by dusk. Telegraph at the nearest relay could carry word to Fort Laramie and to the military department, but not the manpower to reverse the outcome. The immediate effect was decisive 80 U.S. Personnel were killed, and the fort's perimeter posture was re-examined. Settlers and wagon trains adjusted travel timetables and routes, and military stewardship turned toward reinforcement and punitive patrols that placed additional strain on already constrained supply lines. The fight also reshaped perceptions. A consolidated intertribal fighting rhythm was visible to officers who had previously imagined only scattered raiding parties. May-June 1867 to November 1868. Forts and agencies on the Northern Plains Treaty, Promises, and Winter Logistics. The Fort Laramie Accord of 1868 attempted to delimit territories and to replace constant patrols with treaty guarantees, but implementation depended on a supply chain that ran on beef contracts, winter wagon trains, and seasonal river drafts. Harsh winters or a cut in annuities turned a treaty into a conditional truce. Agents and Indian police used interpreters to negotiate ration distributions. Miscommunication or delay could provoke local crises. When beef issues ran low in late winters, families migrated earlier, sometimes colliding with homesteaders' cropping schedules. When interpreters were absent due to illness, the reading of treaty terms left chiefs with fewer options than they had believed. The logistics snapshot is Stark forts could receive telegraphic orders but could not conjure wagons or live herds overnight. A message shortened decision time but could not move grain through spring mud. November 27, 1868, Washita River, Oklahoma Territory. Cheyenne, winter village of Black Kettle. In late autumn, when cold nights drove lodges close to river shelter, Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer led a dawn attack on a winter encampment. The weather was crisp and clear. The element of surprise favored mounted troops operating from a nearby post. News of the raid reached military headquarters by courier and by telegraph in subsequent hours. Agency reports filed the next month recorded survivors and prisoners. The immediate effects were the loss of lodges and provisions. Horses were seized or run off. Winter stores were burned. For many families, the campaign converted a single violent day into a season of hunger and forced movement. Politically, the operation signaled to some officers that aggressive village attacks were an instrument of frontier control. To many chiefs and elders, it confirmed that treaties did not guarantee safety at home. Summer 1873 to 1874. Black Hills approaches and the rising gold rush Dakota Territory enclaves. With Army reconnaissance and civilian prospectors moving into the Black Hills, the pressure on Plains politics tightened. Seasonal scouts brought news of survey parties and miners to winter councils. Courier networks delivered tighter timelines than the old hunting cycles had allowed. The effect was rapid. Some bands accelerated raiding to seize pack trains and horses to supply camps. Others pushed families into agency lands where rations and the risk of police oversight weighted in equal measure. Telegraph lines into frontier posts transmitted alarm, but not remedy reports to Washington produced policy debates and occasional troop detachments, but no immediate restoration of game or grazing. The Sundance that followed those years took place inside a changed ecology, fewer buffalo, more watchful sentries, and a calendar compressed by external demands. Across these incidents, common patterns appear. Seasonal timing mattered. Winter and late autumn attacks amplified displacement because shelter and food caches were fixed. Summer and early autumn incidents disrupted migration and the timing of lodge erection. Signals and delays mattered. The telegraph and military couriers narrowed the political response window, but not the logistical one. Interpreters and agent reports translated promises into the local grammar of ration days and gift distributions, and when translation failed, the result was administrative coercion. Immediate effects were both material and social seizures of horses and stores removed mobility and means. Arrests and disarmament of prominent men created leadership vacuums at precisely the times when councils needed steady hands. Skirmishes pushed whole bands to relocate and to call for more frequent ritual renewal to reassign responsibilities in the face of loss. Viewed from a Sundance lodge, the incidents were not isolated tragedies. They were inputs to the annual reckoning. Each raid, each mass, killing each abrupt ration cut, changed who would stand at the center pole, who would offer horses, and who would receive them. The lodge therefore became an operational meeting, as well as a sacred one. Leaders assessed supplies, retold obligations allowed, and assigned tasks that must be executed in the coming year if the kin network was to survive the next winter or the next patrol season. The rising incidents of the 1860s and 1870s made that annual moment more urgent and more consequential than it had been 2 generations earlier. June 10-26, 1876 Northern Plains Campaign, converging on the Powder River and Little Bighorn Country. 3 United States Army columns set out with the explicit objective of locating and compelling Sioux and Cheyenne bands to return to their agencies. The operation combined Brigadier General George Crook's column moving north from Fort Fetterman, Brigadier General Alfred H. Terry's Dakota column moving west from Fort Abraham Lincoln with elements of Colonel John Gibbon's force to the northwest, and detachments of the 7th Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer, tasked with reconnaissance in force, and if the enemy was found, to fix and strike. The broad order of battle presented a hammer and anvil intent Crook to press from the south, Gibbon from the west, and Terry with Custer to close from the east. June 10-16, 1876. Crook's March. Crook's command moved north along the Powder and Tongue River approaches from Fort Fetterman, with infantry and mounted units, Crow and Shoshone scouts attached, and supply trains at distance. The route cut across mixed prairie and broken ridges, with few reliable ford sites. Timbered coulees provided concealment for ambush, as the later Rosebud fight showed. Crook's logistics depended on mule trains and a limited wagon park, that could not be accelerated beyond a few miles per day in soft ground. At Rosebud Creek on June 17th, Crook encountered coordinated Lakota and Cheyenne forces that contested his advance. After 6 hours of fighting, Crook halted and withdrew to secure his base, thereby removing immediate pressure on the large village to the north. The tactical encounter delayed union of the Army columns by several days. June 17, 1876, Battle of the Rosebud. Crook's force, roughly 950 soldiers plus allied Crow and Shoshone scouts, engaged approximately 1,000 to 1,800 Lakota and Northern Cheyenne warriors under leaders including Crazy Horse. The terrain was line of bluffs and creek terraces. The heat and dust amplified fatigue among mounted men and horses. Crook's dispositions were made for a march, not a protracted field battle. His infantry was stretched thin, and resupply was hours away. Casualty figures for this engagement are comparatively small, but consequential. United States losses are estimated in the mid-teens killed, and several dozen wounded. Native casualties are reported in ranges that historians place between low dozens killed and several dozen wounded. Crook later characterized the outcome in ways that claim victory for his command, while contemporaries and later historians treated the fight as a tactical check on the Army's timetable rather than a decisive rout. June 22-25, 1876. Terry's maneuver and Custer's reconnaissance in force. General Terry detached elements of his Dakota column and ordered Lieutenant Colonel Custer's 7th Cavalry to move in a wide flanking march from the east and south to locate the suspected village, and if found to prevent dispersal, an assignment phrased with limited freedom of action, should Custer have sufficient reason to alter movements. Custer's battalion marched hard over mixed badlands, crossing tributaries of the Rosebud and navigating choke points of Coulee and Ridge. Tactical mobility relied on mounted shock and on rapid dismounted firepower when required. The 7th Cavalry issued roughly 100 carbine rounds per trooper, and accompanying pack ammunition carried a small pack train and a detached Gatling detachment with Terry's main column, though the Gatling was not with Custer at the river valley when contact occurred. Ammunition accounting and horse forage constrained the pace of advance and the ability to sustain a prolonged fight far from the main supply line. June 25-26, 1876. First contact and maneuvers at Little Bighorn. Major Marcus Reno's advance and dismounted charge into the southern edge of the village initiated the contact. Reno's initial action forced rapid movement of non-combatants into protective positions. Non-combatant casualties occurred in the opening phase, including women and children caught amid fighting during Reno's charge. Custer's immediate maneuver separated his 5 companies into a northward and uphill attack, intended to fix and destroy the main village element, while Reno and Captain Benteen operated on flanks and river approaches. Terrain mattered. The Little Bighorn Valley presented open bottomlands bordered by high bluffs and coulees. The absence of a single usable choke point allowed mounted defenders to maneuver rapidly between positions. Native leaders coordinated a multi-axis defense that combined fixing attacks with flank and rear counter movements, overwhelming isolated white detachments that lacked consolidated fields of fire and mutual support. The U.S. 7th Cavalry sustained heavy losses in percentage terms. Contemporary after-action reporting and later compilations list roughly 268 dead and 55 severely wounded among soldiers, with the 5 companies directly with Custer being effectively annihilated. Native warrior estimates vary widely. Modern synthesis places warrior numbers in the field roughly between 100 and 500 depending on counting method, making proportional force relationships contested, but clearly indicating that the village could present massed resistance beyond a single regiment's capacity to subdue quickly. Logistics stress across the operation was acute and continuous. Wagon trains and beef contracts fed Terry's base, but could not be detached to rescue a fast-moving cavalry detachment. Telegraph and courier messages compressed strategic notice, but could not deliver forage or ammunition in hours. Cavalry endurance hinged on horse condition and local grazing. When the 7th Cavalry became engaged in a dispersed set of contacts, the nearest stocks of extra ammunition and men were hours' march away. That separation determined both the tactical outcome and the casualty profile. The inability to mass supporting artillery or the Gatling in time meant that troopers fighting isolated small unit actions faced suppressive fire limits. Rules of engagement and enforcement orders in this theater combined explicit military directives and implicit administrative policies. General orders for the campaign emphasized locating hostile bands and compelling their return to agencies. At the same time, Indian agents had local authority to demand disarmament at designated posts, and military patrols could detain those found outside specified agency limits. The written order detaching Custer to locate and pursue Sitting Bull's village on June 22nd framed action as reconnaissance in force, but granted discretion sufficient reason language so that commanders could adapt on contact. That discretionary clause became a focal point of debate after the fighting. Short orders and after-action statements recorded at the time underlined command intention and reaction. General Terry's written dispatch on June 20 directed Custer to a wide flanking movement to locate the village and to prevent dispersal with latitude to depart orders for cause. General Crook later wrote and told aides that his campaign intention was to make them behave themselves by destroying economic bases, stock, and lodges, rather than to seek indiscriminate slaughter, a formulation which shows the policy logic behind some punitive raids, even as its practice often resulted in civilian suffering. Casualty accounting and non-combatant outcomes require careful qualification. United States battlefield deaths at Little Bighorn are tallied in the high 200s for soldiers with dozens wounded. Several non-combatant Native women and children were killed in Reno's opening action at the river edge. Native losses are variably reported. Primary accounts agency reports and later compiled lists differ, so historians present ranges rather than a single definitive number. Contemporary Army returns and later Park Service reconciliations supply the core counts for U.S. losses. Native counts rely on lodge lists and post-battle summaries made under duress or in retreat. These counting discrepancies generate a clear fact versus folklore boundary, the headline narratives that emerged in newspapers and in public memory, sometimes amplified hero myths or demonized opponents. The archival returns show a more complicated operational record. Fact versus folklore disputes merit brief marking. Fact: 3 converging Army columns operated with stated orders to locate and compel bands onto reservations, and those columns fought at Rosebud and Little Bighorn on the dates above. Folklore stories that a single vision or ritual guaranteed battlefield victory for the Lakota, or that Custer was betrayed by subordinate commanders, simplify complex coordination and logistics. The Sitting Bull vision and its role in morale are documented in multiple accounts, and it functions in Native oral history as an essential explanatory element for choices made. Historians treat the vision as an important morale and cultural factor, but not as a deterministic cause in operational terms. Taken together, the campaign sequence shows how tactical geography, supply limits, command intent, and the timing of orders produced an operational mismatch. Telegraph and courier shortened the strategic window, but not the trailing logistics. The combination of dispersed infantry-mounted shock action, constrained forage, and the presence of sizable mobile Native forces produced a battlefield environment where isolated units could be overwhelmed before reinforcements or heavy firepower could be brought to bear. The confrontation thus crystallized into a hard lesson about the limits of a single regiment offensive against a dispersed but concentrated village force operating on terrain and timelines it controlled. June 25-26, 1876, Little Bighorn Valley. The turning point for this campaign is a short sequence of days that recomposed initiative across the northern plains. Objective for the United States columns was explicit locate large Sioux and Cheyenne encampments and compel return to reservation authority by force if necessary. For many Lakota and Northern Cheyenne bands, the objective was immediate survival. Protect families, recover horses, hold food stores, and to deny the Army a chance to scatter lodges and seize winter supplies. The constraints on both sides were concrete, and intersecting ammunition allowances and forage levels limited how long a cavalry unit could fight on distant ground. Agency annuity timetables and winter beef issues limited when families could move safely, and weather and terrain shaped lines of approach and escape. The Army's march rhythm and supply posture set the conditions. Custer's battalion pushed hard from June 22nd to June 25th along pole trails and through badlands. His force was light on accompanying wagons and far from Terry's main supply. Ammunition allotments were fixed at company issue, and the Gatling detachment and heavier support were not present in Custer's immediate wing factors that narrowed options once contact widened into a general fight. The Lakota and Cheyenne, by contrast, operated from a short internal supply network horse herds for mobility, cached food and goods, and quick access to nearby village resources and warriors. That asymmetric logistics advantage, local resupply versus long-distance dependence, proved decisive when the first contacts turned into sustained multi-point fighting. First contact drove the tactical inflection. Major Marcus Reno's early river crossing and dismounted charge into the southern edge of the village created immediate humanitarian consequences. Non-combatants were swept into panic lodges burned, and families driven to seek shelter under fire. Reno's movement then stalled and withdrew to the bluffs, creating a gap in the intended combined attack. Custer's detachment moved on a separate axis in an effort to fix and destroy the central village body. Terrain-high bluffs and interleaving coulees allowed defenders to mass and move rapidly between threatened sectors. The combined effect was that isolated U.S. detachments could not consolidate fields of fire or mutual support. Native forces shifted from reactive defense to coordinated counterattack and overwhelmed the isolated elements before reinforcements could arrive. Contemporary after-action accounting places U.S. fatalities in the high 200s among those with Custer and dozens wounded overall. Native losses are recorded in widely varying tallies and therefore are presented as ranges in the archival record. The immediate operational effect was an initiative reversal. Where the Army planned to force bands onto reservations, through a converging offensive battlefield, events produced a rout of a single regiment and a temporary shock to campaign momentum that required consolidation, resupply, and political explanation in Washington. For Native bands, the effect was the opposite, a localized assertion of control that made large-scale dispersal unnecessary in the short term and created time and space to move families and caches away from forced appropriation. Politically, the action shifted attention in eastern capitals from quiet enforcement to crisis response, telegraphed outrage, congressional inquiry, and renewed calls for troops while on the ground. It produced village-level decisions to relocate or to reassemble under different leadership patterns. Human cost is both immediate and migratory. Names appear in regiment lists and in winter counts. Among the U.S. officers, the most visible loss was Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his 5 companies, while Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen survived to give testimony and to face inquiry. On the Native side, winter counts and lodge lists record names of warriors and non-combatants who died or were displaced. Families whose lodges were burned at Reno's opening phase moved along winter trails toward agency country, often arriving late for annuity distributions, or forced onto thinner pastures. The long-term displacement path runs from the Little Bighorn area toward agency concentrations on the Tongue Powder and the Missouri routes already stressed by settler traffic and by diminished buffalo herds. The cumulative effect was demographic and psychological camps that previously relied on local foraging, now planned migration and protection routes with greater frequency and greater explicit attention to whether annual lodge obligations could be met. One striking primary admission against interest from the campaign's own commanders captures the policy logic driving many operations. We don't want to kill the Indians, we only want to make them behave themselves. Crook Diary, quoted in Burke, Powder River Campaign, 1976. That sentence reads as an operational confession. The deliberate aim was to destroy the means of continued independence, horse herds, lodges, and food stores, rather than to negotiate full political terms. In practice, the destruction of economic base produced humanitarian collapse for some households and increased pressure to accept agency dependency. The admission therefore reframes the Little Bighorn moment, not as an isolated battle, but as one node in a broader coercive system calibrated to convert social obligation into bureaucratic dependence. Evidence-based counterfactuals are narrow and conditional. Had Custer consolidated with Reno and Benteen before pressing a separate uphill attack had the Gatling detachment been present, or had cavalry forage and extra ammunition been immediately at hand, the regiment might have held a unified defensive posture long enough for Terry's main force to influence the fight. The probability of a high U.S. fatality count would likely have been reduced, though not necessarily avoided given the scale of Native tactical reserves. Conversely, had Army policy emphasized restraint and economic protections, non-seizure of lodges, guaranteed winter rations, honored on schedule, some lodges may have stayed put, and the mass village concentration that produced the engagement might not have formed at that time. These counterfactuals underline that tactical outcomes were tightly coupled to logistics and policy choices. Synthesizing back to the structural forces identified in the causes and buildup, the turning point at Little Bighorn maps directly onto the pressures of treaty enforcement resource collapse and administrative coercion. Treaties and agency routines concentrated expectations of provision and punishment into fixed calendar points. The collapse of the bison economy made lodges and herds more valuable and therefore more likely targets for punitive seizure. And the Army's operational doctrine explicitly tasked to compel movement to agencies created situations where commanders sought immediate material denial of independence rather than negotiated compromise. In short, the battle's tactical mechanics marches divided by terrain, lack of consolidated logistics, ammunition limits were the proximate causes of the military defeat, while the policy backdrop treaty enforcement ration, dependency buffalo decline, shaped why large camps existed where they did, and why destroying lodges and herds was perceived as a viable instrument of control. The turning point thus binds a moment of battlefield loss to a wider century-long reconfiguration of social security and political authority on the Northern Plains. After the 1870s, the legal and administrative map of the Northern Plains shifted decisively toward reservation, governance allotment policy, and assimilation programs. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 remained a reference point on paper, but its promises were steadily narrowed by enforcement practice annuity schedules and the expansion of rail and mining interests that opened previously secure hunting grounds. The treaty text and subsequent agency practice established annuity obligations and policing authority that turned seasonal movement into a timetable dependent on federal deliveries. Law and administration followed a predictable sequence. Congressional and executive policy moved from military suppression to institutional assimilation. Military patrols and campaigns seized immediate control of contested ground. The Bureau of Indian Affairs formalized courts of Indian offenses and enforcement provisions that criminalized many sacred rituals. And by 1887, the General Allotment Act, Dawes Act, authorized the breakup of communally held reservation land into individually titled plots opening surplus lands to non-Indian settlement. These instruments combined to reconfigure legal status, local policing, and land tenure within a generation. Administrative effects were concrete and fast. Agents enforced disarmament orders, detained leaders accused of offending agency rules, and used ration schedules as leverage over compliance with holding rations could be applied as formal punishment under the courts of Indian offenses. Boarding schools removed children from home communities to teach English and vocational skills under an assimilation rubric that also sought to suppress language and ritual practice. The Carlisle model became the template for a network of off-reservation schools that ran into the early 20th century. These programs produced rapid cultural disruption, even as they tethered households to federal supply chains. Land and resource patterns changed in parallel. The commercial bison slaughter of the 1870s and 1880s removed the primary subsistence base for plains societies. Historians and economists link the collapse of the bison to measurable declines in health and resilience across bison-dependent nations, and to the conversion of food security into dependency on agency contracts and market wages. Railroad spurs and mining leases sealed new corridors for settler traffic, and extractive leases constricting access to former wintering grounds and sacred sites. The Dawes allotment process converted common pastures into fractionated parcels, producing both dispossession and the legal pretext for non-Indian purchase and lease. Demography and health registered the costs. Census counts and anthropometric research detect population shifts, rising child mortality in heavily impacted communities, and stunted growth correlated with loss of the bison economy, and with the stresses of ration dependence and boarding school removal. Epidemic smallpox and later influenza waves recurred in the decades after major campaigns, often amplified by constrained nutrition and crowded agency living conditions. These epidemiological patterns deepened the demographic shock and altered family structures visible in winter counts and tribal ledgers. Cultural continuance proved resilient but adaptive. Despite the Code of Indian Offenses and periodic bans, the Sundance and related ceremonial practices persisted, sometimes in reduced or altered forms, sometimes in secret, sometimes relocated to less accessible draws and prairie bottoms. Ledger art. Winter counts and oral histories preserved sequences of events and genealogies that formal records often omitted. Commemorative practice moved into new media, winter counts, and ledger narratives were supplemented by photographic records later, by museum exhibitions, and century later by public memorials and site stewardship programs that recognized battlefield memory on terms negotiated with tribal partners. Memory and formal reckoning have their records. Congressional and investigative reports on Sand Creek 1864 and later federal inquiries placed the massacre and other punitive campaigns into the public record, and in the long term enabled legislative and cultural remedy processes, including National Park Service studies and memorial acts conducted with tribal consultation. The Little Bighorn battlefield itself became a protected national monument and later a locus for cooperative commemoration and research that includes Native perspectives alongside military returns. Those institutional recognitions do not erase the past, but they create shared documentary ground for education and ongoing redress. Present-day continuity is visible in living tribal governments and cultural institutions. The Lakota autonym. Lakota maintained sovereign government structures, such as the Oglala Sioux tribe on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Tribal programs now span information technology, public safety health services, and cultural revitalization projects that work explicitly to restore language and ceremony within sovereignty frameworks. The Northern Cheyenne autonym Sitsestas govern from Lame Deer, Montana, and operate educational and cultural institutions, including Chief Dull Knife College, and tribal cultural programs that steward language and ceremony while managing natural resource decisions on trust lands. These modern institutions reflect both continuance and adaptation communities' sustained ceremonial life, while operating courts, schools, and economic development agencies under the U.S. trust relationship. Legal and cultural programs today extend across several fronts. Tribal land recovery and treaty rights litigation continue in federal courts and administrative forums. Tribal historic preservation offices negotiate site stewardship at battlefields and memorials. Repatriation and museum partnership initiatives return ceremonial objects and human remains under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, processes and new consultation policies, and boarding school truth and healing efforts most recently visible in national monument designations and in coalition projects led by survivor networks seek documentation and restitution. Federal tribal collaborations over park management education, grants, and health programs demonstrate an ongoing but contested pathway from 19th century coercion toward negotiated sovereignty and cultural survival. 3 documents and datasets anchor this account in evidence: the Fort Laramie Treaty Text, 1868, that framed reservation boundaries and annuity obligations; the Code of Indian Offenses, 1883, that criminalized certain ritual life and enabled ration penalties; and the Dawes Act, 1887, that legally fragmented communal landholding and accelerated dispossession. Add to these the documentary traces of the Sand Creek Congressional Record and the National Park Service stewardship files for Little Bighorn and the archival spine for the late 19th century transformation, is clear law, resource destruction, and administrative practice worked together to reshape demographic health land tenure and ceremonial practice across generations. The century's continuance is thus double-edged. Ceremony language and winter counts carried memory forward and sustained community cohesion. At the same time, legal regimes, allotment, and boarding schools altered landholding fields and family rhythms, producing measurable declines in health and livelihood that echo in social statistics for generations. Contemporary tribal governance and cultural programs, from the Oglala Sioux Tribe's community services to Northern Cheyenne educational and cultural institutions, represent active continuance. They are the operational descendants of the Sundance's social logic now exercised through courts, schools, colleges, and carefully negotiated memory projects. Scholarly consensus on the Sundance and the late 19th century Northern Plains crises rests on 3 linked conclusions. First, the Sundance functioned as a sustained political and social institution as much as a religious rite. It organized redistribution, named leadership responsibilities, and renewed collective obligations that conventional state institutions otherwise performed. Second, federal policy in this era, military campaigns, administrative codes, and land tenure reforms operated together to convert independent subsistence systems into forms of dependence through rationing, criminalization of ritual, and allotment. Third, battles and punitive raids such as Rosebud, Little Bighorn, and Sand Creek did not merely make headlines. They altered the tempo of movement and settlement, accelerating legal and economic changes that reshaped lifeways across generations. Contested points remain central to interpretation and public memory. Historians continue to debate casualty counts and force ratios at specific engagements and to argue about the relative weight of logistics versus cultural cohesion in producing battlefield outcomes. Representative military historians emphasize command decisions and ammunition and forage constraints, while Native and ethno-historical scholars stress the role of ritual cohesion and local intelligence in shaping choices. There is also debate over intent versus effect in federal policy. Some contemporaneous officials framed actions as order enforcement, while modern analyses read the same statutes and orders, for example, the Code of Indian Offenses and subsequent allotment laws, as instruments that intentionally undermined collective landholding and ceremonial life. Enduring legacy appears in 3 registers. Doctrinally and legally, the late century sequence fed into formal reforms, the proliferation of Indian policing and courts of Indian offenses, the Dawes allotment regime, and later statutory frameworks for federal trust administration that permanently restructured land tenure and sovereignty relationships. Culturally, winter counts, ledger art, and oral histories preserved sequence and meaning where official records often obscured motives. Those media now inform museum exhibitions, repatriation work, and co-managed site interpretation at places such as Little Bighorn and Sand Creek. Practically contemporary tribal institutions and programs language revival efforts on Pine Ridge and tribal colleges such as Chief Dull Knife College show continuity ceremonial knowledge and governance logic have been retooled into modern sovereignty projects for education, health, and cultural stewardship. Representative records anchoring these judgments include the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 treaty text and implementation records, the Congressional Inquirer's Fire into Sand Creek, the Code of Indian Offenses and Courts, records the General Allotment Act, Dawes Act, and its implementation files, and National Park Service and tribal stewardship documentation for Little Bighorn and related sites. Each document supplies a different strand legal promise: violent rupture, administrative constraint, property reconfiguration, and memory practice that together explain long-term change. Why this episode endures in memory is simple. It shows how a single ceremonial institution, both a sacrament and a practical governance tool, met state power, and how that encounter reordered land law and survival for generations. From Sand Creek to Little Bighorn, the record shows policy and people in painful collision. The Sundance kept obligations visible through it all. Do you have a local story winter count or source that adds a different perspective? Share it in the comments. Thank you for watching.